Eddie Lang and Wes Montgomery, Lee said, taking a fake puff from the cigarette he'd bummed off the waiter when he left the men's room. He talked like he knew what he was talking about. For all they knew, he was an expert on the history of jazz guitar. Why burst their bubble? The night was young, and what they didn't know wouldn't hurt them, at least not for now. That was his problem. He lived in a world of equations, descriptions that gyrate, worlds that can turn sideways after the sun goes down. Dr. Lee LaCosta usually enjoyed his nights out with the boys. His friends could enjoy a good joke and a decent meal, and they were excellent storytellers. Though the atmosphere had changed since the divorce, there were certain subjects which everyone would avoid, and certain jokes, but it was no matter. Tonight they'd had a smoked butt with all the trimmings at their favorite Baltimore watering hole, and they were naturally feeling all of themselves. Kasui, the lone black doctor at the table, seemed charged up to weigh in. There is a thin line between jazz and chaos. I think it's a mistake to be too drawn into swing or the other stuff. Lee, a little bit tipsy, made perfect sense of it. Lee kept his thoughts close, eyeing the rear end of waitress, bending over across the room to pick up a spoon. Lee had waded into jazz guitar a little over 5 years ago, a few months after the divorce was final. He'd played guitar since college, but never had the passion or the discipline to learn anything but the basics of rock and roll, blues and folk. He even took classical lessons for a year, but his teacher was a lesbian who seemed agitated every time his beautiful wife Claire was around. Though it wasn't true, he always felt like she'd assign him lessons that were extra hard, just to make him feel inadequate. In his first lesson, she made sure that he knew she played for the other team. Then she met Claire, and it was all business. It was no mystery why his marriage didn't work out. Claire was gorgeous, charming, funny, and full of energy, while he enjoyed watching old movies and reading mystery books. Most of the heart surgeons at the medical center were members of one of the local glitzy, exclusive country clubs. He occasionally enjoyed their parties, but would rather join a bridge club than a country club. Claire, on the other hand, was always in her element. She could waltz from dar to dar, table to table, and drink to drink, always the life of the party, seemingly oblivious to the lustful leers of her husband's colleagues as they sipped on 12-year scotch or brandy. Square-jawed, handsome, with a touch of salt and pepper in his closely trimmed beard, he'd had his own share of coquettes. Later, Dr. LaCosta discovered that Claire did a little more than waltz with the doctors at the country club, and their lustful jeers did not go totally unnoticed. The birth of their daughter, Melanie, 2 years out of med school, and then William, 22 years later, seemed to be just enough glue to keep the marriage in place. That, and the fact that Claire never had a career of any substance, and had become accustomed to the lifestyle that the wife of a heart surgeon can provide. The spark faded early on, but each of them knew, in the back of their minds, that they had a symbiotic relationship. Tolerate the critter on your rump who's picking at the parasites, then everyone's happy. In many ways, Lee preferred his new life. He'd given Claire every possession that she valued, and that he could live without, downsized to a small condo on Boston Street overlooking the harbor, and tried to reorganize his life. That's when he discovered jazz. It wasn't that he never listened to jazz. In fact, at one time he had an impressive collection of classic jazz albums at the house in Somerset. Like his collection of classic novels, it was rare that anyone even took a glimpse of them. Probably just as well, if they'd engaged him in a conversation about Thelonious Monk or Coltrane, he would be dumbfounded. And it wasn't necessarily that he had had a moment of enlightenment, heard a whisper in his right ear in a midnight bourbon-induced fog that jazz is where it's at, cat. No, it was a more natural, nuanced acquaintance, like his relationship with Linny. Linny, 51, a struggling realtor, was also recently divorced. They'd met when she showed him his new condo, and before long broke it in passionately. Red-haired, full-figured, with laser-like green eyes, her face reflected a life well lived, or worn out. Lee was yet to find out which. Her 20-year-old daughter Melanie lived with her, but was never around, so not a major part of the equation. It had been so long since Lee had made serious, romantic love that he'd had to slowly remember the tempo of the dance and the nuance of the old moves and techniques. A state champion wrestler in high school, he kept himself in pretty good shape, but he knew he was out of practice when their first session lasted only 10 minutes. Like riding a bike, he quipped, to which she smiled approvingly. Where the relationship was going, he was unsure, but so far he was enjoying the ride. It was nice to have a female around to share his triumphs, doubts, and fears. And it didn't hurt that she liked jazz too, or pretended to anyway. Things are not always as they seem. Her ex-husband was another story. Overbearing, controlling, he'd picked up his drinking after the divorce, and Lenny suspected he'd been popping pills as well. A disbarred lawyer, Alexander had joined an ex-cop friend to start up a detective agency. Lenny said she couldn't trust him, and wasn't sure that Alex and his friend had any real clients, or any that paid them anyway. He was not averse to calling Lenny in the middle of the night, first sobbing, then cursing her like a madman. Lee could often overhear the conversations, and, while it made him nervous, he usually faked disinterest and ignorance. Mostly, Lenny took it in stride, but sometimes she too would be left sobbing, whether about him or herself was unclear. Tuesdays at the Pink Spot was open mic night, the only time that Lee ever performed in front of anyone other than a few of his fellow musicians. He had pretty much learned the main catalog of jazz standards he needed to sit in comfortably on an open mic setting, but he was by no means confident in his chops. Take 5, Summertime, Autumn Leaves, Moonglow, So What, Stella by Starlight, Blue Moon, Heart and Soul, and a dozen more he'd memorized, but competent soloing over the rich chord changes could only be achieved with many more years of playing, particularly live, in front of real patrons. The Pink Spot was a small club, just off the harbor, not a mile from Lee's condo, refitted from a pre-1900s dressmaking shop. The walls of the vitrified brick shimmered in the mid-century wall sconces and the small table lamps throughout the room. A string of pink lights ringed the aged cherry wood at the top of the bar. Black and white photos of jazz legends posed as silent sentinels on the smoke-stained walls. Dr. LaCosta and Lenny found a small, round four-top open near the back of the room, where they settled in and ordered drinks, a single malt scotch on the rocks for Lee, a Chardonnay for Lenny. Soon, 2 of Lee's fellow musicians showed up, Freddie Coop Cooper, a drummer, and Pete Slim Dillon, a young but talented sax player. Lee couldn't help but notice the beautiful young girl on Pete's arm. They dragged a nearby table over and began to talk about their day and the upcoming set. Pete's date had an engaging habit of leaning forward every time she grabbed a pretzel, so that everyone on that side of the room could check out her top-shelf treasures. She smiled at Lee once, and he grinned back nervously, just as Lenny put her hand on his leg under the table. The musicians talked about the order of the songs they would play, glancing periodically at the stage, equally complimenting and criticizing the 5 musicians playing their set. The lights on the stage were half working, a combination of opalescent white, faded red, and distant blue. The keyboardist, Big Sam, sat in on every set. He was no Thelonious Monk, but he had a decent blues voice and knew the songs passably well. In addition, he owned the place, so no one ever objected. As the first act wrapped up, Lee and his friends made their way to the stage, awkwardly swapping places with the departing band, who exited to polite applause. The atmosphere was probably livelier when the music stopped, as the conversation and laughter picked up. Though it was the music that had brought them all together, even real enthusiasts would rather hear themselves speak than watch some B-grade jazz. On open mic nights, the room is typically filled, to some extent or another, with friends, acquaintances, onlookers at 3 degrees of separation, mixed in with a few hardcore drug fiends, vagrants, and aspiring players who would never have the chops, or the nerve, to take the Pink Spot stage. This was the angle of the establishment: get half-baked musicians to entertain for free, or free except for a smattering of applause and tips, and draw in the unsuspecting stranger for overpriced drinks and underproportioned appetizers. As Lee's foursome got to their seats, tuned up their instruments, sound-checked and refreshed their drinks, they confirmed once more the order of their set list. Big Sam knew all of the tunes but 2, but he'd fake it as long as he knew the key. Things started smoothly, gliding into Summertime, and then Autumn Leaves, Lee feeling unusually relaxed, thinking they'd very quickly found a nice groove. He'd only made one unnoticeable mistake. He'd switched to the Dorian mode over the 3rd of the scale over the 3rd change, unlike the altered Phrygian, which he'd practiced a million times. Once order was restored, the quartet regained their groove, and Lee shook his head approvingly as Pete Dillon wailed a beautiful, soulful solo on their rendition of Yesterday. It was then that Lee looked up, feeling like a real jazz musician, and suddenly noticed Lenny's ex, Alex, standing in the yellow light at the end of the bar. Red-faced with angry eyes, he was staring at Lee like he might throw a drink at him, or charge the stage. Instead, Lee watched him take a seat at Lenny's table through the hazy stage lights. They kicked off Girl from Ipanema, and Lee tried his best to focus on the rich and delicate chord changes. They transposed it to D minor, lightly placing his fingertips through the voicings, adding a few color notes, always keeping his medium-gauge pick angled at 30 degrees to aid in the attack, inflection, clarity, and tone of each note. But halfway through his solo he made the mistake of glancing again at Lenny, and just then caught saw of her arguing angrily with Alex, causing Lee to miss a full 2 measures of changes before he caught up on the progression. Big Sam, alerted to the miss, looked over to take in the scene at Lenny's table, with a look that could put a man in the hospital. Then Alex stood up at Lenny's table, chugged what was left of his drink, waggled a big finger in Lenny's face, and stormed out of the bar. Now sweat was pouring down Lee's forehead, and his hands were sweating too. Focusing on the remaining 2 songs, Moonglow and Heart and Soul, took all the concentration and composure he could summon. Though only a few of the more engaged musicians in the crowd noticed the sudden awkwardness and rigidity of Lee's playing, Lee internalized it to the point where he felt flashes of heat run up his spine, along with downright fear. Mercifully, the set ended, and Lee turned off his amp and found a stack of cocktail napkins to wipe the sweat from his face. He cased his guitar, then quickly made his way to Lenny. "It's okay," she told him when he inquired. "Alex is just drunk again, furious because Melanie will be out of town this weekend with a coming holiday." "Damn, Lenny, this is just absurd. I wish there was some way to put a distance between you and his constant harassment. The guy has serious anger management issues. I about shit myself on stage." Lenny looked at him and chugged down the rest of her wine, smiling suddenly, amazed that Lee, the macho heart surgeon, weightlifter, wrestler, could be intimidated by anyone. Big Sam stopped by. "Everything cool, Doc?" Sam put a big paw on Lee's shoulder, as if to say, "You just let me know, and I'll put that MFer out of yours in his misery." "We're cool, Sam," Lee assured him, then washed down what was left of his scotch. "Let's go, Lenny. I'll get my axe in gear." When they returned to Lee's condo, it was after midnight, and though both of them were tired, and Lenny tipsy, the excitement of the night had them both feeling oddly frisky. Lee poured them a stiff bourbon, and they proceeded to push each other around the den, alternatively undressing and kissing each newly unveiled erogenous zone, oblivious to the fact that any person walking on the sidewalk by the harbor or docked in the bay could see them in plain view through his expansive picture windows. Lee unbuttoned her sheer turquoise blouse, picked her up, and sat her on the kitchen island, nibbling at her breasts. Lenny unzipped her skirt from behind, then cleverly unclasped her bra, gliding into his embrace. Lee thrust into her, and though mostly still clothed, felt himself edging toward some beautiful foggy forest downpour. Just then, a pounding was heard at the door. Lee stumbled back, and Lenny jumped to the floor, redressing herself as best she could, her hair twisted like a tornado, and her lipstick smeared like a late-night escort. Lee grabbed her arm and cautioned her. "No, don't you dare open that door. How does he know where I live anyway?" Lenny ran a hand through her hair and shot back. "Relax, Lee. He is just drunk. Let me talk to him for 5 minutes in the hallway and he'll settle down. I'll give him some story about Melanie, maybe tell him where I hid some pills by the pool. He'll leave happy, trust me." As Lenny made her way to door, Lee tucked in his shirt and buckled his belt, watching nervously. You could hear Alex yelling something from the hallway, though none of what he was saying was clearly audible, and the pounding continued. Turning the deadbolt, Lenny opened the door just a crack. It was then that Alex slammed the door open, causing it to hit Lenny dead in the forehead, sending her crashing to the hardwood floor, where her head hit once more, and her body turned limp. Alex took 2 steps into the doorway, stood over her, then turned his gaze to Lee. Lee didn't know what to expect now, but his adrenaline had kicked into high gear, as had his anger. Alex was a pretty big man but overweight and dead drunk. If it were to be the survival of the fittest tonight, then Lee had no concerns about how this evening would end. The condition of Lenny was all that complicated the scene as Alex charged headlong at Lee, like he were about to tackle Tom Matt or Lenny Moore. He didn't know that Lee was a champion wrestler, and what was more, that Lee was really pissed now, and knew just how, if he wanted to, end this man's life. Thus, the struggle ensued, as most fights do, deteriorating to a wrestling match, which of course was just what Lee expected, and where he was most comfortable, his own peculiar briar patch. In a matter of seconds, Lee threw Alex onto his back, twisted his knee, almost dislocating it, and grabbed his left wrist till he nearly broke the bones in the elbow. Alex groaned and tried to yell in defiance, but it was the squeals of a roped calf. Then his groans turned into gasps, and the gasps into hollow whispers as his body went limp and his face turned blue. "Damn!" Lee almost voiced aloud as he let Alex's limp body go, face down into the rug. He turned him over, checked his breath, then his pulse. Shit, the man is having a heart attack. Lee jumped up and found his phone, then dialed 911 frantically. He looked across the room as he spoke, calm as a surgeon, looking at his unconscious girlfriend and her ex-husband experiencing cardiac arrest. After a quick check on Lenny's pulse, Lee turned back to Alex and began administering CPR, a technique he'd practiced 100 times but had never performed for a potentially dying person. Alex's breath was nauseating, but the instincts of a doctor and his innate courage kept Lee at his task. In minutes, the paramedics arrived. Lee gave them a quick rundown of the conditions while they put them both on stretchers, put oxygen on their mouths, and began rolling them to the elevator, one rolling the carts, another connecting any number of biologic monitoring nodes all over both of them. In the basement parking lot, Lee forced his way into the ambulance, pulling out his medical ID and convincing the paramedics that he was not going to be deterred and that they might need his expertise before the night was over. It was no big sell. Both paramedics were under 30, and neither had ever dealt with a double patient emergency. For everyone, this was uncharted woods. The ambulance wailed and the lights light up the corridor of buildings as they sped their way north on Light Street to Lombard, where they made a swift left through hastily stopped traffic to the emergency entrance at the University of Maryland Medical Center. Both patients were wheeled into the trauma elevator and taken to the second floor, leaving Dr. Lacosta in the hallway, watching the elevator doors close in front of him. Knowing full well the strict protocol of emergency rooms, Lee took several long breaths, ran his hands through his sweaty hair and made his way to the check-in desk to explain his relationship with the patients, register his occupation, and make his way down the hall to the waiting area. He'd been in this hospital many times, mostly to visit friends or patients, but also to perform the odd surgery. So, he had some real street cred on the property, if it ever came to that. Starving, but with no bills on him, he convinced a complete stranger to loan him a couple dollars for some chips and a soda. He found the bathroom, washed his face and hands, then sat patiently for word on his girlfriend and her deranged ex-husband. Never really big on prayer, he'd seen enough of forgotten prayers in his 30 years as a surgeon to be skeptical. He nevertheless put his head in his hands as though looking at the floor and began, alternatively praying for Lenny, Alex, and himself, partly for forgiveness, partly for redemption, as though it would actually help if he properly distributed his silent conversations with God. He looked up suddenly when a nurse called his name, his mind a world away. "Dr. Lacosta?" she said, standing just inside the doorway. "Yes," he said, standing. "Are you okay? I mean, have you been drinking?" "Why, no, that is, not in the last 2 hours. Why?" "We have a situation. It's best you meet with the doctors in the ER. Can you follow me?" Lee stood up, looked around the room at the other bewildered visitors, and followed the nurse up to ER 12, where a doctor and a nurse stood, looking down at Alex, as though examining a corpse or one soon to be. "What is it?" Lee queried. "Do you know the patient?" The doctor asked. "Yes, he's the ex-husband of my girlfriend. Which, by the way, how is Lenny?" The doctor looked at the nurse. The nurse answered, "She's going to be okay, doctor. She's awake and resting." "Thank God," Dr. Lacosta said, then turned back to the doctor. "So, what's the prognosis?" "Well, the prognosis is that without immediate heart surgery, the patient, Mr. Philopsis, may experience significant and unrecoverable heart problems, maybe even fatal. Dr. Lacosta, our on-call heart surgeon, is unreachable, and the on-duty cardiologist is in surgery already. You see our dilemma?" "Well, just shit," Lee said. "Nurse, take me to the scrub room." Thus it was that Dr. Lacosta committed to emergency treatment of Lenny's ex-husband, the same man who had charged him with every intent to kill him, or at the least injure him severely. Dr. Lacosta's years of experience and training quickly kicked in, and he moved through the prep as though half in a dream. Lee looked carefully at the electrocardiogram and the x-rays, then examined the vital signs on the monitors. Lee ran both his hands up and on Alex's torso, feeling for what no one in the room could discern. The patient's chest had already been shaved, and a surgery sheet draped over him, slit down the middle. His vital signs were moderately stable, but his heartbeat was strained and missing beats. Lee took notice of the familiar tombstone graph lines on the EKG monitor, indicating the classic signs of myocardial infarction. Alex's breathing was also labored. Another doctor entered the room hurriedly, clearly a young intern, female, probably Asian. "So, we need to do a full coronary angiography first." "Doctor," Lacosta declared, looking over at the other doctors for confirmation, which they did by nodding their approval. Lee turned to look at the nurses, who immediately began rolling the patient to the catheterization room for a fluoroscopy. A fluoroscopy involves inserting a small tube, a catheter, into an artery of the heart. A contrast dye is pushed through the catheter into the blood vessels, where a real-time X-ray will show how the blood moves through the vessels and can provide a picture of any blockages. While the other workers set up the catheter, Lee took the time to step away and make his way down the hallway to Linny's hospital room. He walked in and immediately noticed the bandage above her left eye and the small amounts of blood that were seeping through it. He thought about waking her, but he knew it would not be helpful, so he just stood by her side, held her hand, and gave her a kiss on the forehead. Once again, he closed his eyes and said a prayer, alerted to a light rain which had begun to bounce off the window. When Dr. Lacosta rejoined the team in the catheterization lab, he began looking at the images on the screen, scenes like a half-baked video game, blood coursing spasmodically through the spiderweb of arteries with each heartbeat. After a couple of minutes, he sized up the problem confidently, and almost smirking, he declared that he had revised the prognosis. "I believe we can fix him with an RCA stent," he said, surprising both the general surgeon and the other medical professionals. "At least that's my professional opinion." The word had spread about his background and stature amongst the staff. No one challenged his opinion. "So we can avoid cracking open the man's breastbone, rerouting his blood, 5 hours of surgery, and an unknown outcome, at least for now, so please prep for a stent procedure, right coronary artery." Then Dr. Lacosta proceeded to perform the procedure, smoothly, delicately, fingers like a cat on a telephone wire. Coronary angioplasty is a procedure to open clogged vessels near the heart. Uncorrected, the vessels will constrict the flow of blood, the heart could spasm, and eventually lead to cardiac arrest. But the procedure is not trivial, and any mistake could lead to significant pain, a lengthy term in the hospital, or even death. Normally a procedure reserved for interventional cardiologists, Dr. Lacosta remembered enough of the steps to feel comfortable in leading the team. Speaking only the words needed to procure the instruments, politely requesting the devices he used for the steps, keeping the team in perfect time, carefully following the sheet music of the procedure, Dr. Lacosta guided the team on a journey to save the man's life. Once the procedure was done, the patient's vitals stable and the incisions dressed, the doctor made his way to the bathroom, removed his scrubs, washed his face and hands, then walked back to Linny's room. She was just beginning to wake from the sedatives, and he felt a great sense of relief and an emptying of dread washing over him. How beautiful she looked in the dimmed hospital room light. He walked over to her side and kissed her on the cheek. You could just see the moon out of her window, half hidden through the bay fog, its reflection shimmering in the bay. He grabbed her hand. She was just beginning to climb her way back into consciousness, and he saw her shed a single tear, trying to smile, but just barely. "Sleep, little Linny, sleep." Then he turned off the light and fell back into the corner chair, watching the full moon through the window, half shrouded by fog. Lee watched the moon slowly fade into the fog, as though being wrapped in a warm cotton quilt. Then he fell towards sleep, his band's last song, Heart and Soul, playing in the back of his mind.